Afternoon, and welcome to the inaugural Professor Marvin I. Edelman Memorial Lecture presented by Cornell alumnus Michael VanValkenburgh. I'm Tim Baird, Professor and Chair of the Landscape Architecture Department, and we're glad you're here. Michael and Caroline VanValkenburgh have generously endowed this annual lecture in honor of the late Marvin I. Edelman, Professor Emeritus of Landscape Architecture at Cornell. This lecture will be given by an esteemed landscape architecture practitioner who will be selected each year to visit campus to meet with students and to give the lecture about their work. On behalf of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, or CALS, and the Department of Landscape Architecture, I'd like to thank Michael and Caroline for their continuing support of the program, and in particular for this gift of the Edelman Lecture. To me, two of the most important components of a design education are travel and invited lectures. These lectures are considerably more significant for students in relatively remote locations like Ithaca. I'd like to thank Dr. Amy McCune, Senior Associate Dean of CALS, who is here tonight representing our college, and Rich Glick, representing CALS Development, who has been working with us to help make this lecture a reality. I'd also like to thank colleagues in AAP for the use of this venue and for their attendance, if there's anyone here. Also DEA and their students, and I'm hoping that this will be one of many future events that we share together. I'll say a few words about Professor Edelman, and then I'll introduce our speaker. Marvin Edelman was a distinguished landscape architect, a native of Philadelphia, and he attended Delaware Valley College before going on to the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He was best known for his accomplishments during his 36 years as professor of landscape architecture, where he helped to build the landscape architecture program for most of his tenure at Cornell until his retirement in 2008. Prior to joining the Cornell faculty, Edelman worked at Sasaki & Associates in Boston before opening his own practice in Philadelphia. In 1992, he was named a Fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects, and in 2004, he was awarded the prestigious ASLA Jot D. Carpenter Teaching Medal. Edelman designed numerous well-known outdoor spaces, including the Cornell Ithaca Commons, the original Ithaca Commons in 1974, which was one of the first pedestrian malls of its kind. He also designed the Arboretum at the Cornell Botanic Gardens, which was recently named the best Arboretum in the country by Best College Reviews. Professor Edelman's other notable designs included the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology Bird Garden, the garden at Cayuga Medical Center, and Ithaca's Cass Park Children's Spray Pool. And he also redesigned several outdoor spaces at Central New York schools and university campuses. Our speaker tonight, Michael VanValkenburgh, is Charles Elliott Professor of Practice in Landscape Architecture at Harvard's GSD, where he's taught since 1982. He served as program director from 87 to 89 and for a term as chairman of the department from 91 to 96. As founding principal of MVVA, Michael VanValkenburgh Associates, with offices in Brooklyn and Cambridge, he's designed a variety of landscape types ranging from intimate gardens to full-scale urban design undertakings. Some of his recent projects, and you'll see some of these tonight, and you just saw the video of Brooklyn Bridge Park, the Lower Donlands in Toronto, the Monk's Garden at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. Most recently, the firm has been commissioned to design the landscape for the Obama Presidential Center in Chicago and do a master plan for the 308-acre Dorothea Dix Park in Raleigh. MVVA has received numerous design awards, including ASLA Firm of the Year in 2016 and the Brendan Gill Prize from the Municipal Art Society of New York in 2010 for Brooklyn Bridge Park, which is presented annually to the work of art that best captures the spirit and energy of New York City. Michael was the 2003 recipient of the Smithsonian Institution's Cooper Hewitt National Design Award for Environmental Design, and in 2010 became the second landscape architect in history to receive the Arnold Brunner Memorial Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters for contributions to architecture as an art. In 2011, he was named a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, where he's one of only 3 landscape architects on its roster of members. He's also a Fellow of the American Academy in Rome and the ASLA. VanValkenburgh earned a BS in Landscape Architecture from Cornell and an MLA from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. In 2008, Yale University Press published a monograph on his work, Michael VanValkenburgh Associates, Reconstructing Urban Landscapes. Michael VanValkenburgh's approach to creating landscapes and public spaces has also been featured in a wide range of publications, most notably Art in America and Harvard Magazine. Whether it's the large public parks that act as both ecological infrastructure and the calming, beautiful open spaces for human interaction, like Brooklyn Bridge Park and Millrace Park in Columbus, Indiana, or the poetry of small gems like the Verilist Courtyard at the New School and his early ice wall experiments, Michael's mastery of integrating ecological systems with people is clear and legible. His projects are art that works, designed landscapes that perform, not only ecologically but also socially. He engages the user at a variety of levels, from the emotional and spiritual to the educational and material. When I was hired as a visitor to GSD several years ago, I was in the unenviable position of having to co-teach a design studio with noted critic and theorist Beth Meyer. But even more intimidating for that semester is I was asked to teach Michael's legendary plants and design course while he was on sabbatical. The good news is I survived and hoped that a few years later, when he hired me to work for him for a year, that he wouldn't remember who I was. I'm not sure if he did or didn't, and I never bothered to ask, but the experience of getting to know Michael over the years has not only helped universities where I've taught, where he's come and lectured and helped out, like Cornell today, but also he's provided incredible job opportunities for many of my students over the years, and he continues to do so today. As teachers, we're sometimes, we ask our students to not only model and draw landscapes to help better understand them, but we occasionally ask them to write about them to help to be able to see design intent more clearly. And my experience of writing about one of Michael's projects helped me to see the brilliance of his work. I was asked to do a brief perspective for Landscape Architecture magazine to accompany the more comprehensive feature article on one of my favorite projects in his vast body of work, Allegheny Riverfront Park in Pittsburgh. So I wrote back in 2003 about, again, about his ability to engage people with their environment through design. And I realize it's a little pretentious to quote from one's own work, but just think of it as me being sustainable by repurposing some old text. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of the park experience comes when users walk along the river's edge near water level. By eschewing the urge to make a more conventional walkway above flood level that would be accessible all year, the designer has presented an up-close and personal view of the river. The walkway's low position creates a datum by which the natural flow of the river, including floods and ice flows, will be registered. The hardy and easily regenerated native species were planted in anticipation of these often destructive events. Beth Meyer could well have been describing this project when she wrote in the book, Environmentalism and Landscape Architecture, that the landscape architect has constructed an aesthetic experience that focuses attention on nature's forces and flows. This experience reunites the city with its river both visually and ecologically, thus enriching the lives of Pittsburghers and visitors alike. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker to deliver the first Professor Marvin I. Edelman Memorial Lecture from the Cornell class of 1973, Michael VanValkenburgh.
Oh boy, that was a lot. I want to just say a little bit about Marv. I'm going to turn my phone off and put it in front of me so I don't forget it. So the second year I was here, this insanely energetic guy, Marv Edelman, showed up, and there were some good people in the department, but he had a kind of well, first of all, he was an incredibly gentle and an exceedingly humorous man, but what came with that was a kind of burning passion about what I assume most of you aspire to do, which is, something like what I do. He just had this love of landscape. And, when I'm talking to beginners, hopefully not to you because you've already taken the plunge, though there's still time to get out and lots do. When I'm talking to beginners, I'm like, some weeks are pretty tough when you're in practice. And you have to be one of those people that wakes up on Saturday and wants to go be in nature and look at plants. Like you have to so need to be with the medium of landscape. And that's the way Marv was. He just had an incredible energy. As some people here know, he was very ill for quite a while before he died. And about 4 years ago, one of my classmates and I were in Chicago and we went to see him. And, he was like a shriveled, small shell of himself. And he was as alive and vibrant and as joyful to be with. I like to be that full of optimism now, let alone when I'm in my early 80s. So anyway, very big honor of me to be able to keep the memory of Marv alive for a while. Tim sort of gave you a snapshot. Anything that involves landscape, we do in our office, and I actually personally prefer the smaller projects over the bigger projects, just personally. I'm involved with them all. But I thought I would make it focused for you today and talk about just parks and just talk about 3 parks so that it's not just a kind of windshield survey of this and that. And I'm sure many of you know some of our projects. So I'm going to talk about 3 parks, but I want to say a little bit about them. So of course, the city was more a place in the 19th century that you did want to escape from than it is today. It was for most people, it was no air conditioning and poor sanitation and, no roads and no paved roads. And so the park was a place where you went to feel like you were out of the city. And I don't know if others share this view, but my attitude is that I see a park as an escape in the city. And, in some sense, this may feel like I'm just, playing with words. But what I mean by saying this is that the park is as intrinsically a part of the city as any other piece of the city, and that the need to kind of thread your day through some time in a park, because that a day is kind of like a threading of things that we do, and the fact that many of us desire to have that set of feelings and experiences and for me expansiveness that comes with parks is, I think, a normal part of people wanting to live in cities. We used to make parks mostly outside of the city and then let the city, there are no always in anything in life or design, but quite often, at least in Olmsted's time, we were making parks where people knew the city was going to grow to, and that meant a very different kind of design undertaking than what we have today. Today we make most of our parks, not all of them, but most of them on places that have a very strong imprint of prior use. And in our work, just as Olmsted and Vaux took the natural features of the sites they found and often amplified them and built around them, we take many of the things that we find and keep them and build them into what we do. And it's an ethos, but I think it also gives you something that's very connected to the time that you live in. And, the future soon becomes the present, and then right after that, it's the past. And so every time we think that we're doing something that is forward-reaching in a relatively short period of time, it's history. And I come to terms with that by saying, I'm just trying to make things that belong in the world that we live in today. I mean, I'm not thinking that there is something so futuristic about what we're doing. I'm more focused on doing things that are good and have quality because of the value they provide in people's lives. But there are many things about the past and the present that are similar, and the overarching thing about them is that they are for people. The one thing that you'll see as a theme, I don't love that word, or as a connecting tissue of our work is that I'm extremely interested in materials and materiality. And I don't like to refer to what we do as art, but if we are artists among many, the materials of what we do exceptionally demand what we're able to do because of their natural properties. They're not inert the way the materials of this building are relatively, for example. And so the materials kind of move up the ladder in terms of their importance. So let's just take a quick look. They're then in now pairs. They could be titled dignified and undignified, but no, not really. Or uptight and less uptight. But so relaxing, eating outside, not enjoying having her picture taken on the left. Pervert, get out of here. Children's play. These are mostly pictures of Brooklyn Bridge Park. Sports, water play, winter play. So while on the one hand I'm saying, there are things that are very different, parks are ultimately for us, and, we all feel, you more than me, but you feel, very current, and I felt that way when I was your age. You won't feel that way soon, and you're just in a different stage in your life, and I think that that's the important thing about parks. And I have a great grandfather who loved trees, and when I'm very lost, I didn't know him, but I've heard a lot about him, and I will take something that I enjoy. Let's say, some of you know how great linden flowers smell, like incredibly sweet. I will say to myself, I wonder what it smelled like to him. I wonder if it smelled exactly the same to him. And of course, you don't know. You don't know whether the person who's standing next to you and saying they admire linden is enjoying it the way you do. But I suspect it's similar. And I think that thread that we have to the past is very much tied to experience. So going to be a little bit of boring stuff that I think is actually really important. But very quickly, I want to talk about some things that we've learned over the years about park making. And I've already touched on this in one way, which is if you want to make a park, there has to be a place to do it. And in the far along urban condition of the world we live in today, we are increasingly looking to making parks in places where people wouldn't have thought of it as the past. So we're working on an overlay of Houston, 600 square mile park planning project, where a lot of the park planning is under the easements of electric wires, because there are networks of open space quite substantial, and things like that, drainage easements, lowlands. So once we choose those areas, there are these conditions that we find, and that's a connection to the past and the present, but what we find today is so profoundly unlike what would have been found in 1860 when Olmsted started doing Central Park. And then, I know it's a kind of horrible list of things, but governance, like who is going to take care of this park when it's completed? That's what we mean by governance. Like who? Is it going to be the Parks Department? I mean, that would be great in some cities. In most, it might be a challenge. that they would, know how to take care of a new park. And then where's the money going to come from? Until a few years ago, a lot of the parks that we were building were coming from city and state financing, a little bit of federal. That's practically, all gone. And so there are ways that people create tax districts and they look to private philanthropy. And then, of course, what you can do is driven by a budget. I would say that some of the parks that I like the most have actually been made with the smallest square foot budgets because it gave us an opportunity to do kind of inventive things with the way we built the park that gave us something that looked very much not like more conventional parks look like. You don't go anywhere today without the neighbors and the community being involved, and they better be involved significantly. And you need to go about it with the right attitude, not naively that it's necessarily going to be easy, because anytime democracy is working in its full way, it's a challenge. And then, of course, how are the people that are going to govern it actually going to take care of it, and will they be informed in what your design aspirations were, that they will shape it and nurture it and work with you to do that. So we'll talk about 3 parks. You probably know 2 of them, Teardrop, Brooklyn, and then I'm going to talk about this flood protection project, partly because it's, I go to a cocktail party and people say, well, what are you doing? I'm like, oh, I'm moving the mouth of a river in Canada. It's like, oh, okay. I thought that was funny. I just want to show you pictures of the names you know. Designers are, they're always people. And the partnership of these two, when they worked together, was a pretty amazing thing. Olmsted was a cunning, brilliant individual. He was an amazing mind. You all know that he was a writer about social issues for quite a long time. Was probably as responsible for emancipation and the Civil War as any other single figure who was, in the public realm. And he needed talent, drawing talent, and that was the foundation of working with Vaux, but he chose an extremely talented man. So we've talked a little bit about this, you all know the plan, but the thing to remember is that it too was a profoundly disturbed site already when it was started. There were natural features, of course, which couldn't be removed, but there were a lot of things that he found and he amplified, and he built the scheme significantly around the capacity of the natural systems to support what he wanted to do. And just remember, none of the city was there when it was built, and it's not called Central Park because it's central to Manhattan. It's called Central Park because there was a plan for a park on the west side and the east side and one in the middle, the central one. So it was really a reference to the connection between the East River and the Hudson River, and those parks didn't completely ever materialize. So just a couple of things. This is like Cliff Notes. So one of the things that happens when you work on weird sites is the sites tend to be disconnected with the neighborhoods that they're there to serve. So one of our cool youngsters said, oh, we should call them urban junctions where you plug the city into the park, and that has stuck. But so we have particularly an isolated condition in Brooklyn because of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, which you can see in the back, this Robert Moses project that kind of cauterized Brooklyn Heights from the wharf. And it was less of an issue when it was an industrial waterfront. It's a huge issue today. So when we get to those areas, we create spaces that do a number of things. And one of them is that we all, when we enter a new space, like to know who's there. Like you don't go around outdoors in any city and not have some awareness that you want to know what's going on, like who's there. And so all of our entrances have deep sight lines when you arrive. Like you don't come in to a jungle, you don't come into spaces that you can't see in. So, you know, it's driven a little bit by a sense of safety, but it's also a sense of kindness and accommodation of what's going to make people feel good and take the right attitude and feel a sense of welcome in the park. And, you know, ultimately that's an extremely important part of what a park is about. You know, when I was putting this together, I was like, oh my God, you're such an Aggie, Michael. I don't know if that's even said, but it was real stigma when you were here in 1973. I grew up on a farm. I'm like, well, what's wrong? You know, what's the problem? We really love kind of interfacing our designs with engineering. I would say that more than architecture, it's more events in our projects, and the disciplines that we collaborate with more are the sciences that deal with natural systems and engineering, soil sciences, horticulture, those sorts of things. So, you know, we make things like this, which is a way to gain access to the river and to be able to experience the tides and walk down in. And of course, it also is an extremely resilient way to engineer an edge. Presently, when we started, the entire edge was vertical concrete walls called seawalls. You put a wall up. I mean, how many of you grew up near the ocean or been around waves? So, you know, what does a sea do all day at high tide? Just slams in, and no matter how good the engineering of that concrete wall is, it's basically going to fail, or it's going to be undermined by the tides. And so this was something that we saw all over the East Coast. You put these large pieces of stone that are too heavy to be carried away by the tide, and if a wave smashes into it and moves it, what does it do? It just goes, you know, just like, yeah, go ahead, hit me again, you know, I don't care. Like a very drunk frat party, I suppose. I'm sure they don't have those anymore. One of the things we sort of died when we went to the site. Oh my God, it's the greatest site in the world. And oh my God, there's so many horrible things here, like all these empty warehouses. But that really wasn't the attitude that we take. We always see things that we find as an opportunity to do something innovative that somebody didn't expect. And so, you know, this is a piece that we're particularly proud of. The embrace of being black in Brooklyn. 20 years ago when we were starting this wasn't quite the same as it is today. It's hardly over. But, so who plays basketball in America? Everybody. Who plays it more? Not the color of the faces that are in this room today. It is a sport that African Americans are incredibly committed to and accomplish that. And this is the coolest place to play basketball in New York City. So I try not to brag too much, but I'm especially proud of not only that this is here, but how incredibly successful it is and how it becomes this mixing chamber of the park being a collage truly for everybody. And this is what we found on the left, these empty warehouses. Quick story, the reason this site was available to us at all is that in the 50s, somebody said, why do we waste all that money unloading product on piers, take it away in trains and trucks and store it in a warehouse? Let's build warehouses on the water. So these are 5-acre buildings. So when a boat arrived, they took the stuff off the boat and they saved a ton of money by not paying somebody to pick it up twice. Well, what happened 25, 35 years later? Same idea, shipping containers. But you don't ever unload it Once it's loaded wherever it is, it's not unloaded until it reaches a destination. So you took another step out of it. And that made these piers obsolete like 35 years after they were completed. These are like, mid-20th century structures. So that is the kind of industrial obsolescence that gave rise to the opportunity for this park to be here. I don't have time to talk about all the recycling, but one of the things that I think makes Brooklyn Bridge Park comfortable to whoever you are in New York City is that it's gritty and it's a little bit shabby, and there's not a lot of fancy materials. It is the anti-high line. It's like this granite looks like the way it does, not because we distressed it. We didn't run it through the washing machine all weekend. But it was recycled from a bridge and given to us. And we didn't even know what we were going to do with it. We just stacked it until we figured out, sat there for years until an opportunity to use it came up. We had lots of room to store things on. So there you see it, the Roosevelt Island Bridge granite. The Parks Commissioner called us up and said, oh my God, we're going to throw all this granite in the landfill. It makes me sick. Do you think you guys can use it? And we said, we'll figure it out. So they brought it over to us, and that's how it happened. We also, turns out that the buildings that we torn down were made of this incredibly rot-resistant, wonderful wood, longleaf pine, and it was really cost inefficient to do this, but we saved the wood, and it was remilled, and the benches that you see the people sitting on the right side are made of the wood that the warehouses were made of. So one of the great things for me was that I went here and I studied with an amazing plant professor named Dr. Robert Maurer. You did not ever not call Dr. Maurer Dr. Maurer. He hated me. I tried not to hate him. But, between the bright red shoulder length hair and this altered state that I frequently came to class in, and the fact that I boasted to him that I wasn't learning any of the botanical ways of identifying a plant. I was learning how to identify it by its energy. This is very 1973. So I made this huge mistake of saying I would never miss, and it so annoyed him that I liked box elder, just a piece of shit tree. And I said, I'll never miss box elder. And to just show the quality of this guy, every student, and I think there were like 40 of us, got a 2-hour, one-on-one private final exam. I mean, you cannot have answers written on your sleeve. You just cannot fake a 2-hour exam. First question, we're in a patch of ground cover, and I can see Pachysandra and Vinca. I'm like, I got this. Pachysandra and Vinca. He goes over, he pulls it away, and he's like, what's that? And it was like this big, and you all know what cotyledons are? The little leaves that come out of the seed. They bear no resemblance. Box elder is kind of this compound, weird maple leaf. So here's this little thing. It's like a sprout. You have a sprout on your salad, it's just two little dumb leaves. I'm like, I don't know. He's like, I thought you told me you would never miss box elder. I swear, I think he went and planted those seeds. He so fucked me up that I'm still talking about it 38 years later. How sad is that? Anyway, he was amazing. And as I look back on school, I often learned the most from some of the people that I had the most conflict with. Like, they gave me things. I don't mean that all teachers should be assholes. But, a lot of people who are very determined and firm in what they believe actually teach you things that you come back to. So anyway, I hope, there are no box elder here, so I think Dr. Maurer would be happy. But I was green thumb before I got here, and it's always been plants for me. We use too many of them. I think of trees as being like chicken soup, fixes everything. you know, I'm like a Jewish grandmother, you know, have a little chicken soup. Playgrounds, athletics, stormwater recycling. Okay, teardrop. So if you know anything about square foot costs, I think the only project in the world that ever costs more per square foot than this is the High Line, and that's $1 billion a square foot, okay? No, okay. But this is ridiculous. I mean, Tim, a 2-acre park, $17 million, kind of crazy. Just a quick, I'm putting this in here partly because I know you have access to this information later, and you may want to come back and learn some of these things. But, you know, mapped as a 2-acre city park, that's a very significant thing long-term in the future history of parks that you may be making. I'm not going to explain this tax increment because I'm already blabbering on too much here, but that's something that you ought to know about. And you should take a look at their governance model because it's very unique. So here we are in Lower Manhattan. The site is actually on land that was in the Hudson River. And when they built the trade towers, they took all the stuff that they dug out and they put up sheet piles and they created this filled land, and this niche and green is entirely constructed land. Obviously, this is a long time ago. We don't do things. Well, we may be doing them soon, but up until currently, you know, we were trying to amass environmental laws so that we didn't mess up the ecologies of places like rivers. So just kind of a cool bit of history. And the park is a little strange. I think many of you have seen it. It's kind of inside, which privatizes it a little bit, right? Like, you know, I have a friend who lives across the way, and I said, do you take your kids to Teardrop Park? And they're like, what that? And I'm like, you've lived in Tribeca for 10 years with kids and you don't know Teardrop, so it's a bit of a problem. It's also a site that's extremely shady because of tall windows. So we worked with natural light consultants to try to figure out exactly where the sun would be. We did mapping, solar mapping of times of the year. We actually were able to change the height of this building on the left to lower it 2 floors because it would have completely darkened the building where you see the sun there. You know, so you do get involved in really interesting interchanges with the disciplines that surround your park. So this is my idea of research. That is me, thinner and with a mustache. Getting thin again might be a problem. The mustache could happen. It would just have a lot of white in it. But that's certainly a flattering picture of me there. Oh boy. But so I would have nothing to do with Olmsted. Passé. I don't want to go there. And then I moved to New York, and these are my partners. That's Laura looking at me, and that's Matt in the purple shirt and Paul. They're all principals of the firm now. Oh, and I'm like slinking up the hill over there looking like I should have an ankle bracelet on. But I came to New York with a 100-pound dog. And we lived in a studio apartment, and so I took Lulu, her name was Lulu. I took Lulu to Central Park Saturday and Sunday morning in a cab. Cab drivers will pick you up with a dog in New York if there's nobody else out there. So you go out at 6 o'clock, they'll pick you up, and then of course you have to walk back at 9 because they won't pick you up. But I'm like wandering around Central Park, and I'm like, oh man, you know, you made a very big mistake, you know, not seeing it's not that I think that we want to make parks that look like this, although I'm not ashamed that sometimes our parks do borrow this very robust aesthetic of stone, for instance. But the man was, and Vaux in particular, was a genius with proportion and things like this arch. And it may seem like a leap to you, but that gate in Central Park was a very big influence on this gate in Teardrop when we built it. One of the things that are very big to us is we still build physical models. Only recently have I started using the word physical, because you guys think that you model things on the computer. Fine. it's not my idea of a model. It does look like everybody here has a bad headache, but the thing about standing around a model is that you're able to move around it, and it's the closest thing. I mean, landscape is not about pictures and sections. Sections are done for a particular reason, but landscape is about movement and space, and we can't make movies of all of our projects, and so how do you do that? A model is a great way to put yourself in a kind of approximated way. And this was the first big park project of our firm. And you can see kind of quite a different sensibility that was there for a while. And then this idea of the cleft, the kind of plate tectonic section came to me. I grew up in the Hudson Valley, and there were all these places where road cuts revealed the twisting of sedimentary stone, and our charge was to make something that was a scaled down version of the rural landscape of New York. That's what the client asked us to do. I gasped a little bit, since that's what Olmsted did on 900 acres, a little north of the site, but I didn't. By that point in time, I was learning to keep my big mouth shut with clients. And it was this amazing partnership with masons. And I want to say that I love craft, but I don't so much think of myself and my team as the craftsmen, but we're the designers who partner with the making of things. And I mean, this is the favorite thing of mine that I've ever made. Teardrop is my favorite park. I love many of the other ones, but when I go there, this is where I find the most comfort. So this wall was kind of crazy. We actually mocked it up in a quarry, and then the pieces were numbered and taken down and reassembled in New York City. And that was for complex political reasons. Probably not a word I would have used until I was in the later part of my career, but the things that inspire you are what you have to hold on to. But the thing you have to remember is that you don't take everything that inspires you and force it into a project. You have to wait for the opportunity for it to be appropriate. And so this was something that on and off I was thinking about doing for 15 or 18 years, and the big budget certainly helped also. But we found a client that wanted that raw connection to processes of nature, and so it was the opportunity to do that. We also worked with artists. This is not the artist. This is a mason working with the artists Michael Mersil and Ann Hamilton, and this is their model of their art pieces in the park, made out of the same material that we made the rest of our stone pieces with. And this was their decision, that they wanted their art to they didn't want it to stand out as a thing. They didn't care if anybody knew they made it. They wanted it to be embedded into the complete experience of the park. And yet if you go there and you look at this, you know that this is like, wow, this is not a usual thing. I mean, that is nuts. And we're very lucky that they took that attitude in the project. Water play, long story there, crazy slides. Kids like to go fast. Like they do horrible things here. They bring water over, and you can see the water running off the end of the slide. You have no idea how fast that slide goes. My wife could never go and look at it because she was sure our house was going to be taken from injured children. This is just a couple of things. Parks are so incredibly about time moving forward, not just the process that we make them, but part of what we enjoy about them and part of what makes them exciting to us, because they continue to change. So I just have a few pictures of the park being finished, and intern went back a couple years ago and found the same spots and took photos of them. I mean, the big thing I want to say in this photograph is the entire ecology of the ground level changed when the canopy grew up. And there's absolutely nothing that you could do about that. If you put the shade plants in the sun, they would have died. You can see, I'm sure you recognize the daylilies on the left, and on the right you can see there are just no daylilies left, just completely shaded out by what happened over time. I gotta watch the time, talking too much. This is just a cool project. It's $1 billion budget. I mean, in Canada, the federal government, the state government, and the local government actually can make partnerships together. So this is a 3-part funding source channeled through Waterfront Toronto, but they get the money from those 3 entities, and just so cool. I hope we get back to a time when we can do that here. And it's total of about 170 acres. It's all the result of a hurricane in '54 that moved over upstate New York and ended in Toronto. I was alive. I was 3. I can remember it. I was out in the storm. My dad had me under his coat. We were going around to make sure all the doors were locked. You know, on the one hand, you know, you might think, I wonder why a guy takes a 3-year-old baby outside under his coat. And I don't think he was hoping I would disappear, but I suspect that by then he already had a hunch that I love stuff like storms and, you know, the kind of maelstrom of landscape. I mean, maybe it just makes me feel good about memories of my dad, but that's almost my first memory in life. And my birthday is September 5th, so I was 3 years and 1 month old when this storm happened. I mean, tomorrow if you want, I'll give you graphic details. So they started planning this project in 1954, and here we are in 2018. And this is another, I mean, Brooklyn Bridge Park was first spoken in 1982. We were hired in 1998 to start the master plan, and it will be finished in 2021, except in very unusual circumstances. A big park is a very long span of time. And I know that exceeds the age of a number of you in the room, but you know, when you get older, that's actually a kind of really cool thing. It's like really wonderful. It's not some quick idea and then it's over. And you know, quick ideas are usually the bad ideas. I mean, you think they're great, and then it gets built and you're like, that wasn't quite as good, you know, as I hoped it would be. And so this has been a very protracted, and it doesn't necessarily make the project bigger, better, but it often does. This just gives you a sense of the watershed that we're dealing with. The hydrologists described the Don River as a short, flashy river. So you see these valleys that these are a part of. So these are all steep ravines. Toronto is very famous for this. And so you get high velocity of water accelerating flow in the river very quickly. And when that happens, you get stronger flood events. And so the whole Portland's was flooded, and this project is about working with that. That's our site. The little bit of blue, it's green today, but that channel coming in is the engineered mouth of the river. We thought that was an interesting thing, so we left it, but we took the river and cut it right through the middle. But with the idea that the dirt that we dug out would be piled up and we would create islands above the floodway for housing and office buildings in the future. And this is probably like going to never be built out for 30 years future from now. So that was our idea, but it also gave us an opportunity to work with Limnitech, who are river engineers, to make sure that the capacity was there and that we could re-establish a sinuosity so that the curviness that the river has, if you look at it here, this sense of doing this, could have an expression, a legitimate engineered expression in the center of the site. Before this project got as far along as it is, we did another project for the same client on the most toxic site in Canada where all the oil fields were next to the train tracks, and we built an element of the flood retention system. So engineers separately created, it's a little hard to see, but this is a huge flood berm pushed up in the air, and the Don River is coming around, it's coming around from the right side and swinging around. You can see in the far left corner past the GO track, that kind of fluff of green, that's the beginning of the Don River. So this is here to create the opportunity to create the West Donlands neighborhood and to create this new neighborhood that will not be subject to flooding. So that's an example of where funding in a project comes from. Funding of parks is often a caboose on a train that is doing something different and larger in urban structures. So anyway, this was our competition entry, 2007. We don't often make snazzy models, so that, you know, the shock and awe model that people will gasp at, but we thought we should here if we wanted to win, so we made these glass buildings, and you get a sense, and you'll see, this is today, so the engineering and the ecology of the rivers have been really intensely worked for 11 years, and now we're creating the documents to build it. I thought it might be fun to see the model shop. Is Elliot here? Yeah. This is some of Elliot. This is how Elliot wasted his summer. Although I don't quite think that that's your hand. But did you make trees, Elliot? Yeah. Yeah. They look pretty good, actually. So I don't know, 15, 18 people it took to make this model. And this is such a fun thing when you take it for the public, because they're so used to seeing flat drawings and plans, and they're very hard. I mean, come on, we don't really understand plans ourselves. I mean, anybody, I mean, I'm sure there's somebody who does. We don't feel, you know, we have a very abstract and kind of quantitative relationship to plans. What I like about this is that it's visceral, and people love it. They really get a better sense. And I don't mean like love it like, oh, it's a snow job, although there's a touch of that. But people love it because they get it. You know, it's like, they don't necessarily fully get it, but they get such a sharper sense of what's involved. And then we have, you know, the rendering thing too. But I'm showing you a few of these because you can see the extent that recreation of indigenous ecologies, this is a major flyway between United States and, you know, the grounds for nesting for the migratory species. And so this is, they fly over the lake, they really often want to stop, they're tired, the winds are strong, and this is really important habitat for species. The quality of the water is such that it's okay to go kayaking and do things like that. So a big part of what we're doing are creating places where it's easy to get in, and it also just gives, like those kids are about to do over there, which is to, you know, go over and get their feet in the water, and that's a great thing for city kids. And then we're trying to create intriguing areas for kayaking. I mean, it's kind of, you know, it's kind of all micro. This is not like you're in northern Canada, you're in the middle of Toronto, but places that are, you know, very engaging, that kids, you know, particularly these guys in the, you know, who are in the, you know, the tough age for kids is when they're done with playgrounds, and their love interest isn't the focus of their existence when they're teenagers, but, you know, sort of 11, 12, 13. This is really great play for kids of this age. So that's the overview. You can see the island, it's called Villiers Island. The earth that creates the river is sort of piled up, and then the buildings are out of the floodway, and then this is all engineered to be completely flooded in events. All native species. The client understands that there will be certain washouts and damages, but that's true of every river that's subject to flooding. I was looking when I was driving over here today at some creeks on the way in where there'd been some pretty serious flooding. And, okay, Brooklyn Bridge Park, I'm going to try to end in 15 minutes. So the crazy thing is that this project, I told you it started in '82 as a reaction to stop a housing development, but it was a partnership between the city and the state of New York. And you know, there's not a long history of those two entities loving each other. So that's pretty unusual. You can see the square foot price is not bad, but $100 a square foot is kind of only average. So it wasn't like we had some unusual amount of money. The same maintenance funding where taxes in real estate that's developed, instead of going to the state and the city, go to a fund that the governance has, and they have their own money for maintenance. It's a map city park, which means that many of the things about it have to operate within the rules of the government. So when the project started, Brooklyn was one of the most underparked parts of New York City and in the country. So it was an incredible need. So here are those warehouses sitting there empty when we were starting. At the end of being functional, people were using them for lumber storage, but it wasn't wood that arrived on the water. People were just using it like a lumber yard. Now this is a while ago. This is sort of where we were 20 years ago, but you know, we would go to meetings and people would say, I want to play football. And then somebody would say, I don't want them to play football. That's noisy. I want to watch the birds. And you know, I don't want to play football or watch the birds. I want to take my kids. And you know, no, there was this woman who came to every meeting. She must have been such an alcoholic. I just want to have a glass of white wine in the park. It's like every time for 2 years. You know, morning meeting on Saturday, she's yapping about her white wine. So we came up with this idea of explaining to people that a park is a collage of pieces, that sometimes there can be multi-purpose, that things can overlap, but there's basically places that are inspiring and you feel connected to the, you know, magic of the world. They're boundless, and there are places where you can have your glass of wine, and I like to do that too. So, you know, you can sit down and, you know, have a chat and meet a friend, and people like nature, and they don't like it only because we like our connection to the natural world, but natural areas are where animals and animal life and all the birds and all the magic of sound and, you know, seeing a heron arrive, you know, like in New York City. It's just all great stuff. And everybody in the room is just like everybody else who doesn't even know what landscape architecture is. We all enjoy parks in the same way. So this is a little insane. A relatively insane employee did it. Chris Counts, Tim, made this. He's chuckling. Beautiful graphic designer. But we went out to the public and we had 200 meetings. We wrote down everything that was said, and we literally tried to make sure that as much of that was accommodated. So now the park physical structure lent itself to this beautifully. You know it, it's a series of like missing teeth, right? Pier, water, and then a long connection at the edge. And so it lent itself beautifully to being a kind of snack shop of things to do. Oh, you know, you're, you know, a soccer player, you go to Pier 5. You have an artsy kid that isn't physically oriented, you go to the Exploratorium playground on 3, blah, 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 you know. And it's why it's successful. It's why it's successful. I don't know if you can catch the vibe. When I'm rubbing my neck, not a good thing. Like, when I'm doing this, not good. So there's just a lot of joy in the room, you can see. And there were about 10 years of things like this going on. This is our old office in Union Square. Still had the mustache. So I showed you the urban junctions. This is how they tie into the plan, into the 3 major neighborhoods. with the separation that the Brooklyn Heights created. That's the one at the end of Old Fulton Street. And the platform, by the way, is actually an early piece of work by Signe Nielsen that we kept. It's a really beautiful piece of work, but it's basically an opportunity to stand and look at the bridge and look at Lower Manhattan across the way. So just a couple of quick things. I've said this already, but don't predefine what a perfect site is. Like how many of you like to cook? So you know how you go on a vacation, you're gone for 10 days, you come home late, the stores are closed, you're hungry. If you open the refrigerator door and you say, I don't like any of the ingredients that are here, not going to be good. You know, you have to open the door and say, what's the chemistry of the things? That maybe I won't put mayonnaise in the omelet, but I think I could use that, like scrape the mold off of that salsa and like put a little of that in. Nobody will know. That's of course a guy cooking. We had this insane thing that the site was stupefyingly noisy. You all know that decibels have a geometric relationship. Like each jump in a number is significantly more than an arithmetical increase in noise. The sound berms, which took us a very long time to figure out as a solution, reduce the noise in the park from 82 decibels. 82 decibels, if you're standing 5 feet away from somebody, you have to shout to be heard. 68 decibels, normal conversation prevails. We had about 5 years of different ideas, but we worked with an acoustical engineer, and there's a fundamental premise about sound. It's energy, and the longer that it travels, the energy dissipates. And so the berm, what it does is that it doesn't so much deflect the sound, is that it stretches the sound and it repositions it, and it falls as it goes across the site. And that's the central idea of those berms. Now, they're not only there for sound, they're there to screen seeing the highway, and they're also there to put the escarpment back that was taken down when the BQE was built. They pulled this sloping hillside away and they stacked the highway, so that if you think for a second, I'm sure some of you have seen it, if you're to the left in this view and the berm is there, the top of the berm just connects with the urban neighborhood that's above and kind of reconnects the experience of seeing the park to the Brooklyn Heights neighborhood. And some of the berms, because they had to go around buildings, became opportunities for doing some cool things. This is the upland of Pier 5 with a lot of engineering. I had some kids here last year with me, and they talked a little bit about this. And this guy, who's a graduate of the department and a genius, Nick Elkovich, should come and do a technical thing because he oversees the building of our projects. But the soil is impregnated with fibers. Perhaps you know about how this works, but it's basically like three-dimensional organic rebar. As the soil stretches to fall in one way, it puts the fibers in tension and allows you to create one-to-one slopes, which is, you know, pretty unusual. And then we have built a lot of the park with a great landscape contractor, Kelco, and they came up with this thing we call the lasagna method, where stabilizers and soil are layered up together. You can see it in the diagram, and it allows them to create a platform for building much of the height until the piece gets so narrow at the top that the equipment has to go away, but it's super efficient way to build the berms. And then we had this huge problem of everything. You put seed on something that's as steep and it rains, what happens? All the seeds at the bottom. And we tried to do it with jute, but the jute created a shade environment that made the plants that were very sun-loving not want to live there, and so that didn't work either. Somebody was looking at National Geographic magazine, Nick in fact, and he saw this article about how goat hoofs created little indentations in slopes in parts of the world, and that's how grasses got established in steep slopes. And so we had people stipple, take 2x4s and stipple the ground, and then we seeded it. And so the seed is basically in a series of little tiny plateaus on the side of the berm, and then after they're established, they reach out. And then the other thing we didn't do in the first berm was to create these little walking terraces for the maintenance guys, so that these little catwalks wind their way up the berms and people can go up there and water and rake and do stuff like that. So this is right by my house. When I'm feeling like being a landscape architect is shit, I go out and look at this and feel pretty good. It is shit sometimes, come on. I mean, can you imagine a doctor doesn't have a bad day? I wonder if they ever have a good day. We're pretty lucky. So anyway, you can see how it's maintained, and then the other plants come. It's a meadow now, and that's what it looked like in the beginning of this summer. And it really didn't work out very well, but we tried maintaining it with goats, and I just knew that somebody at the ag school would be charmed by that. So I have to just tell you a great story, and then I'll end soon. So this is Mickey Murphy, and this is my first Brooklyn Bridge. How am I doing on time, Tim? Okay? All right, I'll try to finish in an hour and a half. So already you can see kind of like a serious presence. So I didn't even live in Brooklyn when we started on this project, so we'd come down from Cambridge with our little, our corduroy jackets on, and I probably only wore brown, I don't know. And this woman got up and the whole place went quiet, and I'm like, oh gosh, what the hell's gonna happen? And she got up there and she said this amazing thing that's here, which she basically said, I'm retired, I don't have a lot of money anymore, I can't go to the country in the summer, I want to go down to Brooklyn Bridge Park at night when the moon is full and put my toes in the East River. This is not yesterday, this is 1998. The East River was only becoming a place where the meat wouldn't be etched off your toes if you put them in the East River, right? Like the water quality is just changing. But it signaled a sea change in culture of parks. Something happened. There was a switch that happened, and people started to want to feel connected to nature when they're outside. The history of the firm is built on this park on the right, which is flooded very dramatically. So we've almost always worked on sites where clients have severe flooding problems. Hurricane Sandy came and went, and there were some surprises. Of only about 10% of our plants that were underwater died from the salt. We had quite a lot of loss of electrical things, but basically all that stone edging and the fact that we tried to put root balls above the 100-year storm level gave us a high survival. We do a lot of research and observation. We're making a salt marsh. We go out, this is the whole office working on the project with an ecologist who's also a Cornell Ag School grad, a wetland restoration expert, and we got totally informed about the cultivation of salt marsh hay, which is grown in Pinelands Nursery here in salt water, so that when it's brought to the site, it's acclimated to the salinity that it's going to have. And we took this area where there had been a concrete cap over a piece of the East River, and we pulled it off. And we actually left the piles because it was cheaper to leave them than to take them away. I don't want to suggest that we didn't recognize also that that would be extremely beautiful and a kind of marker of the tide going up and down all day. And we created this little salt marsh. And we don't think that we're saving the ecology of the world by including that salt marsh there. We think we're giving people experientially a small piece of the natural landscape for enjoyment, and because of the animals that are attracted to being there. I mean, a week after it was made, there was a turtle that swam in from the sea, and there were 4 nesting pairs of ducks, all different species, within the first 2 years of making the salt marsh. Just an incredible, and you know, a park is a collage of things. I mean, it could have been that the salt marsh could have been a larger organizing theme, but like I said, people, the bird people were so insistent about wanting to do things, and you know, it was done in a somewhat obligatory way. I think we didn't really understand that this is also what Mickey Murphy was saying that she wanted us to do. And you know, at you know, certain lunar systems, the water goes over the whole protection system and goes through the whole thing, and a pretty serious piece of engineering that went along with it. I'll just go through this quick. You can see how high the water is there, and then how it looks at the end of summer. I just want to say one thing, which is that I'm sure you already know this, but it's a very fun piece of work of how you take pieces of the park and you make sure that there are multiple things that the same site is providing. So this, when the screen's not there, when the beach blankets aren't there, when there's not 800 people there, this is the greatest view of the Statue of Liberty in New York City. It's just an open lawn that sweeps out to the harbor, but it also has the function of fulfilling this amphitheater need. I haven't talked about it too much tonight because I actually, I don't mean to make this sound the way, I almost feel like as landscape architects, we talk too much about things like this at the expense of not talking about the other things that happen. So I'm sure you're well schooled in reuse and stormwater, and I certainly am not diminishing its importance, and it's a big part of Brooklyn Bridge Park. But so I'm almost at the end. I just thought you'd enjoy some before and after pairs, where we were about 16 years ago and where we are today. And this is late because that empty pier in the middle is completed this summer. And also just how quickly a park, once it's planted, becomes something that's very visceral and strong. The neighbors all hated our light poles, and the light poles today are just completely embedded in trees that in 10 years have, you know, grown up to be 40 feet tall. So I'm just going to end on some things that I think parks do for us. I wanted to talk today mostly about the how of park making, not the why of park making. But this is a little bit about the why and what parks give back to us. That's it. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Questions?
Always a sign that a talk is a disaster if there are no questions.
Don't embarrass us. Ask the question.
How old are you?
Jay,
Yes.
can you, Michael, can you talk a little bit about the politics of Brooklyn Bridge Park between that time from the early 80s to when you were brought on? There was a lot that happened between the state and the city to make that possible, and that affected clearly your design and your movement to that process. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how that was initiated.
I'll give you 2 sound bites because it's a novel.
Sure.
I'm sure some of you have seen pictures of what parks in New York City looked like in the 60s and the 70s. And they really didn't start to be improved until the 80s, and that was only in rich neighborhoods like Central Park. So when the idea of this park came up, John Ausschuler of HRNA came up with the idea, and he said, we will ask the city and the state for the money to build the park. We will use the TIF to collect the revenue to take care of the park. You might say, isn't making the park more expensive than taking care of it? No way, because a park is there forever. One of the things we had to do was to calculate the operating cost of the park. Actually, Signe Nielsen did that for us. $15 to $18 million a year to maintain the park. In 10 years, you've spent $200 million. Park's not going to go away. $200 million in 10 years, in 100 years is pretty easy math. So one of the political decisions was get the capital, tell the mayor, tell the governor they get to be at a ribbon cutting, and then their entities do not have to come up with the money to maintain it. The park being maintained was the thing that most of the neighbors who were opposed to it grabbed onto. They point to other parks and say, how is this park not going to be like the way Central Park was 20 years ago? Answer, there's a bank of money to maintain the park in perpetuity from all those apartment buildings that were built. None of that tax revenue goes to the state or the city. It all goes to a kitty that the governance group organizes. The one other political thing is that Brooklyn Heights, where I live, is white and well-to-do. They did not want basketball. B, they did not want basketball. They'd want black people to come to the park to play basketball. This was a huge fight. And of course, they were smart enough to not say that. They just became opposed to the park in its entirety because that neighborhood is so insular. And one of the coolest things in the park today is you can go there and not even hear English spoken for minutes. There's so many different languages in Brooklyn, and it's a really cool thing. Anything else before we stop?
I have a question about the one-to-one burn. You said it was efficient. Like, what sense of efficiency is that? Like the one-to-one burn, the technique you used was very efficient, you said?
Tim, could you repeat what he said?
The one berm is efficient. What did you mean by that?
Efficient?
Efficient,
Yeah. Like, is it the material that you used that made it like strong or?
What's happening when the berm gets flatter? We're using up the parkland, right?
Yeah.
So if the park is this wide and the berm is like this, when I said efficient, I should have been clearer. I meant that we are efficiently blocking the sound but not using up the precious, because the acreage sounds big, but the upland is narrow. If you've been there, you've seen it. It's kind of long and skinny. So we had to come up with a way to be high enough to hit the level of the upper tier, but not use up the parkland.
Why I was interested in this because I like the form, and how much did that contribute to the budget? Like, is it an expensive feature to do that? Like, how much expensive compared to like making a beautiful berm?
I would say that if you were going to take everything in the park and divide it into 3 categories, frugal, moderate, and high, the berms are high compared to the other pieces. Is that what you're asking? Yeah, they're the more technically challenging. They have all that structure within them. That engineered soil is expensive. The installation, hand labor, I mean, crazy expensive. Think of guys dimpling acres,
I'm comparing that to the eye drop. They're crazy, right? Like building a berm that is one-to-one and then an eye drop. Like teardrop, yeah.
Oh, teardrop.
Yeah.
There's a little difference, but I like it. Yeah, well, teardrop just was, we had lavish materials. I mean, there were, and in its time, it was the greenest park in America. All the water is repurposed brown water from the surrounding buildings, and it's all filtered and treated and recycled in a vault that's behind that stone wall. I mean, if you guys come down on a tour, either I or somebody from the office, anytime, my early career was built around internships and people being kind to me, and we go out of our way to do that. I mean, I think we've helped out some of you guys before, but just give us a little notice. If I can't do it, I'll put somebody else at it. They're usually smarter than me anyway. I'm smart enough to hire people that are smarter than me. Very important thing to do if you want to succeed. Yeah.
So Michael, I'm guessing you worked with a lot of architects throughout your career.
I can't believe I'm here in this room.
I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about why some were really great to work with and why some...
And why most of them weren't. Max Scoggin and Merrill Elam, one of my favorite husband and wife team. Mac is an insanely wonderful human being, which I don't think you would say about a lot of architects. And maybe not a lot of landscape architects, but he is. Just a man that, he's full of love, and he's amazing. You should look up his work. You probably don't know it. Because he just doesn't, he's not, I mean, he deserves more recognition than he's had. But I remember our first job, and I said, well, what are your thoughts about the landscape around this house? And he's like, that's what I hired you for. You know, I want to have ideas, like surprise me. Don't make something that's like my house. I don't want the landscape to look like I did it. It should be like a piece of music playing out. I mean, who says this stuff, you know? So I think the architects that are great to work with love landscape. It's not like, oh, you know, like over there, don't touch my building. They love landscape. And they're confident enough that they're true collaborators, not puppeteers. You know, can I tell you a great story about Cornell? There was this amazing guy that taught here, Colin Rowe, and he was Rem Koolhaas's teacher, and he actually got sick, and some friend of his taught the class, and I can't remember, but he was basically the same thing, like some snobby English guy, you know, just, I mean, actually it was one of the most amazing classes I ever took. But this guy, Colin interviewed us in his apartment, which he seemed to enjoy perhaps more than he should, and would definitely not happen in today's world, if you follow my drift. So I sat down, and he's like, what department are you in? And I was like, gee, he didn't ask me what school I'm in. So I said, I'm in LA. He thought I was in liberal arts. He thought I was amazing until the end of the class, when I told him, he'd already decided he liked me, so it was cool. But you know, he just would have had his mind made up that it wouldn't work out for me to be in the class. Anyway. Was that adequate? You know, the one I was trying to think of the 38 years since I graduated, or 35 or whatever. What's the greatest thing that happened in landscape architecture? That we have as much credibility in the world as architecture does. And I think that's why the collaborations are changing, because people no longer have quite the division of significance that existed mid-20th. I mean, I was mid-20th century, but I was inheriting the world that my teachers grew up in the generation before me. Yeah.
So I have a question about the Brooklyn Bridge. I noticed in the section, involved the section you have the drawing shows you keep all the poles in the water. You said one aspect is because it's cheaper to keep it, but I do notice you represent some fish in it, so it may create some fish habitat.
Oh, absolutely.
Is that intentionally, like you carefully studied, or it's kind of like an extra that just got it? And also, what's the driver or kind of the purpose you guys want to create kind of the not purpose, but so if that plus the wetland become a habitat, is there like you guys carefully planned it, or it's something you did and then that's some kind of like an extra, or what's the relationship that you're kind of curious about it?
The poles are absolutely there because we couldn't afford to take them away. But we were not unable to know that there were good consequences because of that decision. In other words, if it was a disaster, we might have looked someplace else in the budget. We would have given up something to get rid of them. We really couldn't afford it. I also would say that many of them are wrapped with asbestos, not good stuff, and they're capped. And it would have been incredibly difficult to dispose of that material, and basically contamination. The strategy about contamination today is that if you can leave it where it is, it's better than dumping it on somebody else, right? So those were the drivers. It's not like Pollyanna. It's like, oh, well, maybe the fish would come. And you're like, oh, well, the fish are already there. That's a good thing. And, oh, the tide's going to go up and down. And so the way of reconciling a decision is kind of dynamic, and it has a life of its own, I mean, it's not just in school, in practice too. You stand up in front of a client. You have to defend. I mean, hopefully we don't make up lies and excuses, but we're often quite cunning, and we say things. We know how to pull at heartstrings. We know how, who doesn't like fish? Like, why wouldn't you say the fish are going to be happy? Oh, it's true, Olmsted, you should read his writings about design. You cannot believe what a clever. I mean, you know the story of Jackson Park? Jackson Park in Chicago, where the Obama Library is. They took Olmsted out there. They said, we want a park here. He said, he doesn't swear. I would have said, this is a shitty place for a park. Take me someplace else. They said, I'm sorry, you're going to make a park here. It was all flat and wet. It is one of the most ecologically radical parks of the last 150 years. It's entirely about expanding and extending the water systems of the park to make the presence of the water the thing that dominates its existence. I mean, I hope you can see the connection to keeping the pools, right? Like, I think that pile field is one of the beloved things in the park. I think it's one of the most photographed places. People go there and take pictures of Lower Manhattan with those graphic poles in the foreground. I hope that was clear. I'm glad it was clear to you. I didn't understand it.
I have a quick question. Maybe it's a sentiment that you share, having been in the department and gone through the school, but there's a big disconnect between obviously the landscape architecture department and the architecture department and other design disciplines. Do you see, or maybe would you like to see more room for collaboration between?
No. And I'll tell you why. If you're going to play the clarinet in the orchestra, you ought to get really good at playing the clarinet before you try to play in an orchestra. I am just not a big fan on interdisciplinary. I've taught, and this is a rehearsed speech for your question. You might have heard the little rage that came out with it. But I just make really good landscape architects, and when they're strong and confident and others, and people will see that we have something to offer. Yeah, I have a strong opinion about that. Some other things too. Yes,
So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the future of the profession.
thoughts on what?
The future of the profession. I know it's a very
Oh, the
long
future?
question.
Well, that's your problem. Maybe I'll be lucky and I'll have another 20 years, but I don't know. How could we not do well? How could what we do not be something there's more need for? I don't know. I feel good about it. I think we're making too many ordinary landscape architects, and it would be better to make fewer better ones. But, you know, who asked me? You know, I think it's a good time to be a landscape architect. I'm one of 5 kids, and all my siblings couldn't wait to retire. You know, I go to my high school reunion, which is interesting for upstate New York with my class of 40. Only the one that escaped. And they're all retired. Like, when are you going to retire? I'm like, why would I stop having such a good time? I don't have a good time all day. But why would, I mean, I make things, I get to watch them grow. I see, nobody knows who I am when I'm in Brooklyn Bridge Park. I know who I am. I wander around, I see people having amazing time. You know, it's deeply rewarding. So I'm optimistic. I'm actually a optimist who hides my optimism with cynicism and attitude. But, you know, basically, I'm all warm and cuddly on the inside. I'm close enough now that I can see that you're not white. I'm rather nearsighted. It's really fun to stop wearing glasses when you get older. So back there, everybody looks the same, but we need many more non-white people in our discipline. It's a heartbreak for me. My grandkids are not white, and it's something very important to me. And we need diversity. You, if you stay in the field, will especially have a good future career because we really need non-white people in the
I
field.
actually teach in the department.
All the better. All the better. I'm sorry, I didn't know. You look exceedingly young for me. How's that? Did I come back in?
I probably shouldn't say here, but my birthday is next week, so.
All right, let's see. I hope everybody took note of that. Just asked. Are you a Virgo or the next one?
Libra.
All right, yeah, Virgo's tough sign. One more question and then we'll stop. Okay, well, thank you all for coming out.
I'm just wondering how concerned you are with using native plants in your plants.
Native. Sometimes it's extremely important. If you're making a garden, come on, please. You need to make a garden. I mean, I'm not saying put some horrible invasive plant in. You have to put something that wants to grow where you're going to use it. Lots of times it's not a native. But you can see, I don't think there's a single plant. There will not be a single plant in the Toronto project. The Parks Department will not let you use anything that's not native. And native is not a Canadian-American hybrid. You can't use a hybrid with a tree that doesn't grow in Canada. So, but that project deserves to be native because it's in a sense of kind of recreation, you know, of the native tradition. How do you feel?
Well, I asked specifically because I saw a lot of Rosa rugosa in the Brooklyn Bridge Park, and I just know that that can be a real pain to maintain, and I was just wondering how that panned out.
It would have panned out better if the horticulturalist who runs the park didn't think we should have used more natives. She's not fond of our Rosa rugosa. I mean, if Rebecca was here, I would have said the same thing. She's amazing. But I keep trying to get her to be more brutal with it.
Yeah.
Like, I have a house on Martha's Vineyard, and I see people take lawnmowers to it. It's like bring it, you know. Yeah, just go ahead and mow me down, like I will be back so fast. So, but it's thorny and so pretty though. Well, that was a good question to end on. Thank you all.
Just a reminder, Michael will be in the building tomorrow. We're going to wear him out before he gets away. At 10:45, I think it is, and 4:61, he'll be there.